Thank you, Keith. Yes, I'm afraid it's me again. It's Manchester, it's a UKNOF meeting, and I get to grovel through my memory from what we were doing about 20 odd years ago. I came to the conclusion last night when we were at drinks that it's probably safe to talk about things from the late 90s because it's 2 decades. It's far enough ago that I probably won't get sued, which is a good thing. So am I about to push the wrong button on here? No. So where were we before? Well, I think 3 years ago I was talking about old ISPs, EUNet. What did we do? Big ancient routers. Did any of it work? Kind of. Then we had moving on to ISPs needing more than 100 meg. That was really fast, but not fast enough. The routing table at 50,000 routes. Who would ever thought it would have got this big? And will we even make it to Y2K? Well, I'm pleased to say we did. We got out the other side. A lot of this talk is about building a data center. Some of you might recognize that building. That is the LHC. It's down the bottom of Mill Harbour in London. In sort of late 98, early 99, that was being fitted out by a company called Telelinks. Now, they had the enterprising idea of trying to take half of Telehouse's name, plus a bit of the Links' name, to try and sort of trade on the back of both. This led to a lot of consternation from legal teams from both Telehouse and the Links, and for once PSINet did something good and bought them and made the problem go away. Well, unfortunately, this made them my problem because they were fitting out this building as a data center. I've got some tips. What you don't do is you don't start with a mothballed office building. So that building had been built, I think, late 80s, early 90s, never filled out because of the recession, the property market crashed, and it sat around. So it was an empty shell. It didn't have enough riser space. It didn't have enough power, even after we'd used up more and more of the car park to put transformers in. Apparently it was cheap, so obviously the bean counters were winning even back then. One thing that happened is me and my colleague, some of you know him, Douglas Hall, we were drafted in to go down there and basically build it out from a networks and systems perspective. So what we did first of all is we went off to see PSINet's flagship data center in Herndon to see what they were doing there. It looked okay, you know, this is pretty vanilla data center stuff, rows of racks, neat cabling, groups of people who seemed to know what they were doing, a nice knock with the windows that the visiting customers could look through, all the usual stuff. And we came back to our building. And our main data floor looked like this. This was potentially problematic. We were going to have to speed up the builders, I fear. In fact, that one was clearly taken a bit later because you can actually see there was a raised floor there. I think earlier versions of this, there was just a concrete slab. And that was the third floor of the LHC, so the principal data suite. As a result of this, Doug and I rapidly became involved in the data center fit-out. There was no point in us thinking, hey, what routers and servers do we need in here when we didn't have floors, powers, or cooling? So we would pretty much spend the beginning of every day walking from the bottom of the basement to the top of the roof to see what disasters the contractors had done the previous day. And you know, these were howlers, like we'd spot a water pump that was clearly installed the wrong way round, despite the fact there were big arrows saying flow this way. And we're thinking, hang on, we're not experts at this. If we can spot this, why are you guys not spotting it? But that was the nature of the beast, and it was an interesting few months, that's for sure. Of course, sales being sales, they'd already sold stuff and promised the customer that they could have it in. So we needed a temporary data space. That little delightful mess was boo.com. Some of you will know that name too. They had a spectacularly good knack of burning through vast quantities of VC cache and turning it, I think, into alcohol and parties and large amounts of Sun kit. That temporary row of racks had a whole raft of big Sun 450s in it, if I remember rightly, and they'd contracted for a whopping 500 meg of bandwidth, which at prices back then was quite a lot to be buying. All of that kit there needed to be professionally cleaned at vast expense afterwards, because despite the fact we'd been promised that this was actually a sealed room, plasterboard dust got in, and every single fan, every single filter was caked in the stuff. It looked like the Sahara Desert when you looked inside one of the routers that was in there. It was just covered in, yeah, nice white dust. This does not go down well with your kit. So what were we doing in there in these early days? So that temporary room had a single 45 meg circuit back to Telehouse on an old Cisco 7204. That was a bit limiting, not least because sales had sold 500 meg to Boo. Luckily they weren't using it at the time, but you know, a 10-to-1 oversubscription ratio, that sounded about right. It was limiting for things like us moving data around, backups, all of the sort of boring stuff. We'd had dark fibre put in between the LHC and Telehouse, diverse routing through the Isle of Dogs. Unfortunately, the fibre pop in that building wasn't ready at this point. It was back in the days of SDH. It was a room full of vast amounts of Nortel kit, all doing 2.4 gig, down to various, all the way speeds down to 2 meg. But this pop wasn't ready, so we couldn't use that. So what did we do? Well, I did what any impatient engineer would do. I stole one of those pairs of dark fibres, got an Ethernet, gigabit Ethernet LX GBIC at both ends, and plugged it into an Ethernet switch, lit it at 1 gig. Problem solved. Actually, it wasn't quite solved, because the only switches we had were old Extreme Summit 48s, which were two 1 gig ports and 4800 meg ports. So what we ended up having to do is have several hundred meg split out on different ports for different purposes. But we were still winning. It was more than 45. The fibre knock were particularly unimpressed by this, because they were trying to bring up their SDH a month or so later and couldn't work out why one of their legs wasn't working. So sent remote hands to have a look, who pointed out that it was no longer patched in and were demanding that we connected it back up. I pointed out that we had customers on it, so they'd have to wait till a maintenance window. And they were based in Canada, so we had distance on our side here. We were there, they weren't. In terms of the network, we made the decision of basically making the data center its own AS. So the network saw it as a downstream BGP customer, which obviously would be an obvious thing to do today. Back then it wasn't necessarily the same thing to do. And we had great big Cisco GSRs as border routers and a layer of extreme switching and routing below that. The Cisco GSR was a big brute. Whopping 2.4 gig a second backplane. What you can see in there is 3 STM4, so 622 meg cards that went up to the POP in the building, and 2 gigabit Ethernet cards. So you know, we're talking whopping port density here, 1 gig E port per card. The other thing these chassis had was at the bottom of each line card there was a little LCD. It wasn't LCD, it was sort of LED style display that would give diag information and would say iOS run when they were running. This was exposed in the MIB, and you could send SNMP writes to it to change the text. We never actually had it swearing, but quite often you would have routers saying things like free me or send help or any other thing that was passing. A customer did notice this and mentioned it, so we stopped doing that. Doug reminded me actually this morning when I sent him a copy of this that we took these two routers down from Cambridge, where they'd been in the lab and testing, in the back of a car, which these days, goods in transit insurance and all that. On loading them in, they got dropped. One of them got dropped in a muddy puddle outside the Cambridge office, which didn't do it any permanent damage except made its fans very noisy. So it was christened Helicopter and went into the DNS as that forevermore. Very few people up until this time knew why that was called Helicopter in the DNS, but there you go. Below those, this is all pretty standard networking actually now. We had a pair of Summit 7Is. The Extreme Summit 7I was a 32-port 100-1000 switch with 4 1 gig GBICs. So we had 2 of those as cores, and we had the concept of a neighborhood of racks. Now, they were either very dense. There was either a very dense requirement for switch ports in those, or a very sparse one. In an open colo area, for example, a single chassis could do a very big area because you might only have one connection for a row of racks. In the dedicated web hosting areas where you'd have a rack full of 40 servers, obviously you need a top of rack switch, so we did something slightly different there. We had a Summit in the top of a rack, and they were aggregated by Summit 1Is. These are 8-port 1 gig switches, and we actually had 2 of those for redundancy. On the subject of redundancy, I was looking at some of the stuff that that we provisioned. We didn't really provision multiple feeds to a rack like we would maybe today. If you took a rack and some data, it would be second nature to have 2 fibers or 2 copper connections and 2 power feeds underneath. This was an expensive luxury, whether it simply was the demand wasn't there from sales, or it wasn't being offered technically, so people didn't tend to want it, is left as an exercise to the reader. So there's a little network diagram. I actually had to draw that last night because I couldn't find an original one, so it came from memory. The thing we didn't have in this design, and this was deliberate at the time, but I'd never do it again, was there was no east-west links between routers and cores, so traffic had to go up or down. This meant we had interesting IBGP fun and games between those 2 borders. So yeah, I wouldn't really recommend doing that. It seemed a good idea at the time. Moving on to what we had for sort of managed servers, we would offer, obviously you could buy co-location space, but you could buy a managed web server where essentially we would do everything up to operating system level and web server level, and the customer did the rest. We had the Cobalt racks 2 and 3, rack 2s originally, that's a Cobalt rack 3. These were quite nice little boxes actually, 1U, MIPS processor, ran a variant of Red Hat Linux. They were cheap. They were essentially hosting provider in a box. If you were doing My First ISP, it gave you everything you wanted. It had a control panel, did email, did web serving, and did a reasonable job of it. The first generation ones were a bit flaky, but I think by the time they got to the rack 4, they were quite nice boxes. If you wanted Windows or Linux with something with a bit more grunt, we offered 2 HP net server boxes. They were battle cruisers, really. The one on the left, the LPR, I ran my personal web server on in the data center for some years, which was grossly overpowered for it. If you wanted more than 2 disks, you got the thing on the right, which used up, I think, about 6U, and goodness knows how much power. You wouldn't want to power any of these today at current data center power rates. If you really were feeling extravagant, you would go for the big Suns. The Sun Enterprise 450 on the right was basically a large fan heater. It had, and is probably currently less powerful than a Raspberry Pi. That closed door basically had a lot of drive bays in it. It was just a huge amount of empty space, and I think 4 power supplies in there. That one's the model that's on, obviously on wheels for a standalone, but there was a rack mount version. So essentially, we gave the option of PCs or Suns. Some other things that we did was load balancing, F5 big IP boxes if customers wanted it, and firewalls were Nokia boxes running Checkpoint. I don't recall us ever managing to get those to multi-tenant properly, so I think people were sold individual pairs of boxes. The only problem that we had is that we were recruiting staff and we were growing, and it was all sounding quite promising. But no one had really come up with any office space, and you must remember, despite the fact this was an office building, most of its floors were just bare concrete. One weekend, Doug and I got a bit fed up with this, so we just moved into the main data center floor. There was plenty of space there. What you can actually see, has this thing got a laser in it? Which button do I push? That one. That row of racks there is the boo.com infrastructure, having moved out of the spare room at the very back there, plus a bunch of desks. At least we had good and easy connectivity to our infrastructure. I did work out last night that at the current Equinix prices with cross connects, that lot would have cost about 60 grand a month, that desk space. So it's probably just as well we won't send a bill. We had some fun times as well. The boat chase scene, I don't know if anybody remembers it from the start of the Bond film, The World Is Not Enough, where Bond comes out of the MI6 building and goes down the Thames. Part of that was filmed in Millwall Dock outside the LHC. So we watched for a bit while this stuntman dressed as Bond with someone chasing him in a speedboat did thrashes up and down the dock, gratuitously exceeding its speed limit. Which was quite amusing. And I think you can see just in one or two frames in the opening sequence the LHC building on the corner. This is one of my favourite pictures from the build-out where our lovely contractors had bricked up a fire exit, not even bothered to turn off the emergency exit sign, not provided another emergency exit. Sums it all up, really. There's definitely no escape for you. There were some fun times. I mean, we had some quite interesting early adopting customers. And for example, the one I'm thinking of is Easy Everything when Stelios decided to get into internet cafes. I was going to do a slide on this, but decided that I wouldn't change my slide deck first thing this morning. They had discovered that, much to the annoyance of sales guys, at PSI, that if you basically took a rack and ordered BT circuits straight into your rack, you could get a much cheaper cost than if you ordered 2 meg lease lines or faster directly from sales as an internet access product. This caused some consternation in sales because anybody who had enough nous and wanted enough circuits to do this found that their revenue that they would have earned from leased lines was being seriously undermined by the fact that customers could do it themselves. Of course, nowadays, it's taken as a matter of course that you can take a rack in a data center and order circuits to it. But back then, this was causing a bit of irritation, let's say, with some of the sales staff's commission. But it worked out in the end, and Easy Everything was quite an amusing project where we had a couple of big Cisco 7513s. They were the massive great routers, and a bunch of, I think they had 34 or 8 meg lease lines out to various internet cafes around London as an early adopter of that, which, you know, back in 1999 was a whopping amount of bandwidth to have to a coffee shop. So the data center finally managed to open itself in July 1999. This didn't go without a hitch because we allowed everybody to use exactly one lift, and that lift had a member of the maintenance staff sitting on its roof, making sure that it didn't stop short of a floor, which it was prone to do when we had a bunch of senior vice presidents from the US in the car. We thought that might be career-limiting moves. There was some amusement when I think the guy on the roof of the lift coughed, and they weren't entirely sure where this noise had come from. But most of these problems were sorted out by the end of 1999. And of course, at the end of 1999, we had some more fun, didn't we? The Y2K thing. So during most of 98 and 99, any of us who were around during that year will remember we spent an awful lot of time in meetings with expensive Y2K consultants asking about what happens if this box doesn't know what the time is. Apparently, the right answer is not, it will just log the wrong time and none of us give a damn. No. We had to do extensive research to work out if this router logged the wrong time, whether it would just implode and stop routing traffic. Of course, like a lot of people in this room, most of our servers were Unix-based, so it was 2038 that was going to cause us a problem, not 2000. Luckily, when it got to New Year's Eve, what happened? Well, from memory, the Lynx had a conference call. In fact, the Lynx had I think a Winnebago-style thing parked in the Telehouse car park for this. Such was the hype around it. There was a conference bridge that was open before midnight. I was on it, along with probably some other people in this room. And by about 10 past midnight, we were discussing the Queen's hat because nothing of any interest whatsoever had happened. So all that planning, much maligned, clearly had paid off, which is probably a good thing because I don't think any of us could have coped with the whole world ending. It is unusual to find me talking about football. I have to admit that I'm not really one of those people who follows their football team slavishly. I might just about manage to tell you if Brighton and Hove Albion are about to get relegated, but that's probably because I learnt it third hand through some friends. PSINet, being in the middle of that .com boom and wanting to spend marketing money, which we seem to be able to spend at a frightening pace, not quite as fast as Boo, but it was a good effort. They were a global sponsor of Euro 2000. This was kind of the first time that a major sporting event will have what I will call a useful website, in that the sort of thing that we would expect today from, say, the Olympics or the FA Cup or anything like that. The website didn't have any video or audio due to broadcast rights, but what there was all of the things today that you might expect just to get from, say, the BBC sport pages. There was a text-based running commentary of matches. There was a list of match fixtures, results, match reports, background information on teams, and any other news. And this was pretty novel in 2000. Ignoring the football side of it, how did it work? Well, we basically built a globally load-balanced network across, I think it was 5 data centers and POPs, ranging from the US, around Europe, and the UK. We did DNS-based load balancing with F5's Global Traffic Manager product, which seemed to work quite well. Local load balancing between hosts within the POPs was using ArrowPoint, and they were bought by Cisco shortly after this, which they went sort of downhill a bit, I think, then. And if I recall correctly, we had some very early adoption of Anycast for some of these server IP addresses across PSINet's backbone. Now, at the time, I thought that it would be completely unacceptable to leak these outside. You know, we can't originate the same prefix by different bits of the network to the internet. You know, everybody will think we're horrible doing that, and of course, it's now standard practice. But you know, back then we were doing it internally, and you know, it seemed to work. So it clearly works now. For this, because big numbers are good, PSI agreed to provide a whopping 1 gigabit a second of total capacity for this website. At the time, this was the speed of the Lynx's main switch interconnects. There was no way that they were going to use that. And I'd like to say Paul's rule of 10% applied. It applied to boo.com. It applied here. Ask for a gig, you're actually going to use 100 meg. And the peak traffic, as we recorded, here is the obligatory network stats graph, because I have to get one in. The peak traffic was just shy of 100 meg. That was about 3,000 hits a second on the website. That peak was at half-time during the France versus Holland semi-final. Now, this tournament being dual-homed to the Netherlands and Belgium, obviously France versus Holland was a particularly important match to them. And it was quite a good match, because I actually went to that match. I don't go to many football matches, but the entire UKNOF engineering team, in fact, most of the people from PSI involved in this project went to the match. I had a Nokia communicator open by my feet monitoring the status, just in case anything went wrong. It was interesting when we wanted to go to the bar or anything, because we all had to hide, because there were UEFA officials who knew who we were and thought that we were all very busily and diligently sitting and slaving over screens in a building out near the airport, when actually we were at the match. In case you can't or won't remember, that was a Nokia communicator. This was the smartphone for the early 2000s. Really quite a nice piece of kit, had a screen, had a QWERTY keyboard. I certainly remember being the envy of my friends and colleagues when they were replying to text messages by hammering buttons with their thumbs. I was typing out beautifully punctuated and spaced things on a keyboard in seconds. Definitely the way to go. Well, I snapped that picture at one of the events that we did at Euro 2000. The error message reads, "A fatal error has occurred. Click OK to quit." PSI were ahead of the field. PSI filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in June 2001. I mean, that was a whole 6 months before most of the other big .com providers. So, you know, PSI were always out there leading the field. They were innovative. Rumours that this was caused by my expenses claims when I spent 6 months working for them in Australia are completely exaggerated and false, and I will entertain none of them. Any questions? Oh, good, no difficult ones. You want coffee, don't you? At least I'm not preventing you from having beer. That's the really serious place to be. Thanks.